So I want us to start right here by just reviewing a little bit, okay? So let's make sure that we know what we've done in the last couple of lectures, okay? So first of all, remember that we identified 3 types of cells that are responsible for developing, maintaining, and changing the skeletal system. You should remember osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Okay, 3 types of cells. Osteoblasts build layers of bone matrix. Once they're built, the cells become trapped within the layers. We call them osteocytes. They maintain that matrix. Sometimes layers of bone get removed, sculpted would be a better way to say it, into other sorts of shapes. And those we call osteoclasts, the cells that do that. They form 2 types of bone tissue, and we talked quite a bit about cancellous bone and about compact bone. We said cancellous bone is like a lattice, lots of open spaces. The trabeculae are the little stick-like pieces that form a framework of bone, very much like the framework of a house. Most houses built in Southern California first go up as a bunch of 2x4s nailed together. Somebody has done a plan. They've engineered the plan so that every 2x4 is creating some support somewhere. It's exactly what cancellous bone is like. Cancellous bone is little branches, little beams, little girders, little structures of bone, but it's in an open framework. And that open space then leaves room for red bone marrow, the tissue that produces your blood. And typically cancellous bone is found internal, is inside the bone. Compact bone is also made out of layers, but hopefully you remember the osteon and the various ways that the layers are put together in very dense patterns to create compact bone. And we said that we find compact bone then on the surface of bones. This is why bones from the outside look so dense and hard, is because from the outside you always see the compact bone. So we've established the cellular foundation for this. We've looked at 2 distinct types of bone tissue that are produced. Those 2 types are not different in the matrix. The matrix is the same. They're not different in the layering. Layers are always there. It's how those layers are organized that creates 2 different types of bone. Now, what we're about today is to look at bones as organs. So each and every bone of the skeletal system is what we would call an organ of that system. And it's an organ because there are many tissues. Well, we've seen that there are 2 different bone tissues, but there are also going to be nerve tissues. There's going to be lots of connective tissues associated with the bone. Epithelial muscular tissues will be in some of the blood vessels that run through the bone. And of course, cartilage is going to be associated with the bone as well. So many tissues organized together create an organ. And so each and every bone of the skeletal system is an organ. Now let's talk about the bones specifically. When we want to discuss the structure of bones, there's so many bones that it's easiest if we first categorize them. So let's put bones into several types, we'll find that the growth, the development, and the basic structure of similar bones are useful to study. So, typically we categorize the bones by their shape. So, the first one that I would call your attention to is what is called the flat bone. Okay, many bones in the skeletal system have a flat nature to them. One that might occur to you right away would be the sternum. You've looked at the sternum with its three parts. That is essentially, its basic shape is that it is flat. Last week we looked at the lower limb bones. The upper part of the coxa is called the ilium. It's very flat. It's got two distinct sides and a number of edges. In the skull, the bones that enclose the brain are all very flat in their structure. And one that many people don't think about, but if you remember studying the ribs are very flat. I don't know about you, but I always thought of ribs like round rods, sort of. But they're actually more like ribbons. They're much more flat as they curve around than they are round. So many places in the human body you can find bones that are flat bones. And they all have a similar growth pattern to them and a structure. A second category that's prominent throughout the human body are what are called long bones. Now you have to be careful with the term long bones. When we say long bones, we don't mean big bones. Okay? Long bones have a shape in which they are longer than they are wide. The example of the femur here is pretty obvious. It's sort of the dog bone shape. And if you see a cartoon with a dog burying a bone or whatever, it's usually something like this with a shaft and two knobby ends. That's the shape of a long bone. The foot here has some long bones in it that are not very big. Do you see them? So I'm showing you a foot here, and the bones called the metatarsals that are right before the toes, these are not very big, but they definitely have a long bone shape to them. Not only that, but if we look at the bones here in the toes, they're even smaller. Tiny little things, even the ones out at the tip. But even the ones out at the tip, you see a wideness, you see a little bit of a narrowing, and then a wideness again. That basic shape is what we call the long bone. And even the tiny little bones of your fingers or your toes are still long bones. Not size, but shape. If we have long bones, then guess what? We have short bones. Short bones have just sort of a regular, blocky shape to them. We're looking for bones that don't have any real oddities about them. They just have a standard sort of compact shape. Again, in the foot, if you're looking at a picture of the foot, all of these bones behind the metatarsals, as a group, these 7 bones are called tarsals. Those tarsal bones are all very block-like. And that's basically what we think of when we think of a short bone. Most of the bones fit into these categories. There are a number of bones throughout the human body that have very odd shapes to them. And so we create a category that's sort of a catch-all for this. We simply call it the irregular shaped bones. Your vertebra would be an example of that. If I took all of this fancy stuff off the back of the vertebra and just had the body, what do you think I would call it then? If all I had was the body, it would just be a short bone, wouldn't it? It would just be sort of a blocky, regular shaped bone. But with all these fancy little processes sticking out the back and up and down and all of that, it's got a very odd shape to it. If I was looking at the coxa, for instance, we always take the coxa, divide it into ilium, ischium, and pubis. The ischium and pubis have very sort of irregular shapes to them if you separate them from the other parts of the coxa. In and around your face, there are a lot of very oddly shaped bones that make up your face. So there are places throughout the human body where we find some real odd-shaped bones. We just put them into this one category. So these are the four major types of bones. There is a fifth category, though, that I do want you to know, and it's called the sesamoid bone. The patella, illustrated here, is a good example of it. It's different than other bones because it typically doesn't just stand by itself like so many bones do. It's not literally connected from bone to bone to bone. What makes the sesamoid bone interesting is that it's found in the midst of connective tissues. So if I have a muscle connected to a bone, I might find a sesamoid bone in the middle of that connective tissue. The patella is a good example of that. If you take your leg and your thigh and you straighten it out so that the muscles of the front of your thigh are all relaxed, you can grab your kneecap and just dance it around, can't you? You know there's something different about your kneecap versus all your other bones that are sort of tightly locked into a skeleton. The kneecap is embedded in connective tissues between some muscles and a bone. And so it functions in a slightly different way. Sesamoid bones are always very round, oval, tend to be very smooth. They're sitting in the midst of these connective tissues. There are other sesamoid bones found throughout. For example, there's some in your foot, and if you were to look at the structure of your foot itself, if you came out to the point where your foot meets your toes, okay, the metatarsal bones are in your foot, the phalanges out here in your toes. If you look at the joints here where your toes meet your foot, they're right here. This first metatarsal right here, the end of the first metatarsal is an important balance point for your foot. And if I turn the foot over like this and look at the distal end here, look at that. There are two little oval bones that sit right under the distal end of the first metatarsal. These are in a location that people usually refer to as the ball of your foot. You ever heard that term before? The ball of your foot? If you haven't, it's referring to that spot right behind your big toe. It's right where your big toe meets your foot. If you look at the bottom of any number of fancy tennis shoes, you often see some extra support there or some extra hard rubber, often in a little circle right there. And that's because as a balance point for your foot, if somebody is moving very quickly in a sports activity of some kind, they typically push right off the ball of their foot. Athletes that need to move very quickly are trained to keep their heels up off the ground. You don't move very fast if you're sitting back on your heels. If you're a tennis player, you're going to return a very fast serve coming at you, 100 miles an hour or more. And you've got to be able to react. You don't sit back. You're up on your toes and the anterior part of your foot, and you're typically balanced inward onto that ball so that you can move one way or the other very, very quickly. That ball of your foot is supported by these two little sesamoid bones. They're right in the midst of the connective tissues that connect and support the great toe back into the foot. So they're floating there the same way your patella is floating over your knee area. Okay? So, sesamoid bone is kind of a specialized type. There's very few of these, but the ones that are there are important, and they are different from the other bones of the body. So, now that we've identified these 5 different types, the 4 major types and the extra one, let's talk about how these bones are constructed. And for the most part, we've already described that. Okay? Each and every one of these bone types is supported internally by cancellous bone. Okay? If you cut open any one of these basic types of bone, you're going to find cancellous bone with red bone marrow. Now, there is one exception to this. Okay? Each one of the bone types you saw is going to have compact layers over the surface, so the surface looks very hard. There is one exception, though. In the long bone shape, we're going to find one change to this pattern. All the other bones are going to be similar. Okay? All of the other bones, sesamoid bones, flat bones, short bones, irregularly shaped bones. Okay, the long bone is going to be the one with a difference. Let's look at a long bone then and see where the difference is. Here you see the femur, and we're just looking at the proximal end of the femur. The distal end is exactly like this. We need to have a couple of new vocabulary words to talk about the long bone, because we want to distinguish between the shaft of the long bone and its knobby ends. So, we're going to refer to the shaft of a long bone as the diaphysis of the bone. Okay? Very important word to know. When somebody speaks of the diaphysis of a bone, they're speaking about a long bone. And they're speaking specifically about the shaft structure of the bone. Now the bone has 2 knobby ends to it. Each of those 2 ends is going to be called an epiphysis. So long bone has a single diaphysis and 2 epiphyses, plural for epiphysis. Since there are 2 epiphyses, how will I tell them apart? How would I indicate one versus the other? What 2 words would I use? I could use superior and inferior because in the anatomical position most of these are up and down, but these are mostly in the limbs, and so it's more appropriate if we use proximal and distal. You can tell the proximal end of the femur from the distal end of the femur very easily. So there's a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis. So that's where we want to start. You want to make sure you know and understand those 2 words. Now we're going to make a distinction with their structures. Let's start with the epiphyses. Okay? Either epiphysis, doesn't matter. We're showing you the proximal one. We could be looking at the distal one. The epiphyses are structured exactly like every other bone in the human body. They have a cancellous support structure internally and a compact veneer over the outside surface. Okay? Epiphysis is structured like all other types of bone. Where we're going to find the major difference in a long bone is in the diaphysis of the bone. As you might guess, because its length, it could be the most fragile part of a bone. If you have a little blocky bone, and you would think, how would I apply force to this thing to fracture it? You know, a small, little, tough, compact bone, not too tough. But a long bone is going to have so much length that if you put force against that length, you could fracture, it could break, like breaking a pencil or breaking a stick. The longer it is, the easier it is to get force on it, to get leverage and to break it. So the diaphysis of a long bone is built to be extra strong. And here we find a very, very thick layer of compact bone. So thick, in fact, that it doesn't need much support internally. There will always be a little bit of cancellous bone on the inside, but not much. Thick, compact bone is going to make the diaphysis extra strong so it is not easily broken given its length. Now when you have this thick, compact bone with just a little bit of cancellous bone here, then you're going to wind up with a hollow space inside the diaphysis of the bone. This hollow space is called the medullary cavity of the bone. The medullary cavity. The medullary cavity is not empty. We're going to find bone marrow in the medullary cavity. But that bone marrow can be one of two types. We've talked quite a bit about red bone marrow. There's another type of bone marrow called yellow bone marrow, which is just a filler. Yellow bone marrow is actually just adipose tissue. Okay? When you're a child and your bones are very small, there's going to be thick, compact bone, but just the fact that the bone is smaller means there's less compact bone there. The cavity is going to be much, much smaller. It's going to be lots of more cancellous bone generally within this area. In a child's bone, we find red bone marrow even in the medullary cavity. But as you grow through your teenage years, as the bones get larger and larger, the cavity gets bigger and bigger. The red bone marrow retreats to just the little bit of cancellous bone that's there. Of course, it's throughout the cancellous bone of the epiphyses, but the body begins to replace the red bone marrow of the medullary cavity with yellow bone marrow. So as you get older and older, your body just packs that cavity full of fat. Yellow bone marrow. There is a membrane in this cavity, around the cavity, that will sort of separate that fat from the red bone marrow. You don't want any of that fat mixing in with the blood that is moving through the cancellous bone spaces. That's called the endosteum. Now that endosteum is, I'm mentioning it, it's not that big a deal. Doesn't come up in a lot of situations. There is another membrane that you do need to know. There is another layer of tissue that is very, very important to the bone itself, and that is the covering over the outside surface of the bone. Every bone is covered at its surface with a layer of dense connective tissue called the periosteum. Peri is a little prefix that means around, so periosteum literally means around the bone. And specifically here we're talking about around the outside surface of the bone. The periosteum forms the actual surface of the bone. Does anybody know what a leotard is? Know what a leotard is? How tightly does it cling to a surface of the body? Very tight, right? It's built to do that. Dancers wear these. So they have baggy little clothes on when they're dancing, right? Very, very tight. Picture the periosteum as the leotard of the bone. Okay? Fits down into every little nook, cranny, fissure, feature, notch, any little surface, whatever. This is the surface of the bone. I don't know if you've ever, I hope you haven't, I don't know if you've ever seen a wound that was cut down to the bone. If you've ever seen a bone, it looks brilliant white. Not because the bone tissue itself is white. It really isn't so white. We often make it look white, but it isn't. But the periosteum is. The periosteum is brilliant white. You know, look at any of these models around the room, the connective tissues that are represented here. Or look at how they represent the connective tissues on the model there. You've actually seen it. Do you remember skinning the cat? Remember cutting the skin and looking at the edge of the skin? Do you remember how brilliant white that was? Connective tissues, dense, collagenous connective tissues in your human body are brilliant white. And every bone looks that way because its surface is that connective tissue. Now, what's the big advantage to that? Well, muscles need to hang on to bones. And muscles are attached to bones by cords of connective tissue we call tendons, right? Dense, fibrous connective tissue. Guess what? The periosteum and the connecting tissue of the muscle are the same stuff. They just weave their fibers together, and so the muscle hangs on to the fiber of the periosteum. The periosteum is hanging on to the bone, and the connection is made then between the bone and the muscle through the periosteum and the tendon weaving their fibers together. So the periosteum is a very, very important part of the bone. If you look at a skeleton like this, one of the interesting things they've done here is painted the surface of the bones with red and blue. Everywhere you see red and blue, that's where a muscle is attached. Look at how much attachment there is to all of these bones. Those attachments are all into the periosteum of the bones. We're going to talk about the periosteum even more when we talk about joints. And you're going to see a remarkable integration of bones and connective tissues and muscles to form this skeleton that formulates and allows for us to move. Okay? So periosteum, very, very important. Endosteum, kind of important, not that big a deal. Now let's kind of put so much of what we've talked about now about bone together. Here's a picture from your textbook that is really a very nice summary of what you would see. Now this is showing just the diaphysis, but I see all the major features of the tissue and structure of the bone. I see a periosteum here covering the surface of the bone. Notice if blood vessels are going to get into the bone, they've got to come through that periosteum. You can see lots of blood vessels woven in through there. I see compact bone, pretty thick here. I see cancellous bone. You know, not a lot of it. There's still a cavity here, but a little bit of cancellous bone woven along the inner surface of all of this compact bone. If I look closely at the compact bone, I can see the osteons illustrated. I can see where the interstitial layers would be. I can see where the circumferential layers are. I can see the central canals running down through. I can see perforating canals crossing in places. So I can see so much of what we talked about, not at the microscopic level, but at that level where we can see the actual layers of bone. So this is kind of a nice summary of everything we've talked about. Okay? You ought to be able to take any bone of the human body and use your x-ray vision now. You ought to be able to, you look at somebody's bone and you ought to be able to think, okay, what do I see? What am I looking at? Okay? I'm going to pass around a couple of pieces of bone here. These are the distal ends of a femur, a real femur. And you can see by looking down in, you can see the medullary cavity. You can see the cancellous bone. You can see how thick the compact bone is. Right? So take a good look at that. If you look at the surface of the compact bone too, you can see lots of little tiny holes over the surface of the bone where blood vessels enter. Bones are very, very rich in a blood supply. Right? The blood is so integral to the bone. You break a major bone, you can bleed significantly because bones are so rich in blood. All right, so this is the organ level, the various ways we categorize them into shapes, and then how the tissues, the cancellous and the compact tissues, are integrated into the structure of all bones. Okay? The last thing that we want to deal with then, letter D on your handout, is just a little bit about bone growth. We know that if you're going to have more bone, osteoblasts are going to come along and add layers of bone to what is already there. The growth of bone is going to take place both externally and internally. Now, right away you would think, okay, if I have a bone and I'm going to imagine it growing from a child's bone to an adult's bone. A child has the basic shape of an adult bone. You would guess you would just add more and more layers to it. And as you do, the bone would grow in the same shape, but it would just get bigger and bigger as you add more and more and more surface to it. Just add more external layers. Now, you have to go beyond just adding more external layers. Let me illustrate. Here's a bone. I just made a very simple box shape for a bone. Maybe this is one of the bones in your foot. And imagine it growing in the same shape to get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And as it does, right, the osteoblasts are simply adding more and more layers. The bone grows to be the same bone, but with an adult size to it. Now, this can't be all that's happening, though. You can't just add more and more and more compact layers and have a functional bone. What would be wrong with a bone, a short bone like this, having this much compact bone? What would be wrong with that? It'd be heavy, wouldn't it? Partly. But has the cancellous bone grown to be an adult-sized cancellous bone? This amount of cancellous bone is the same size it was in the child, isn't it? And What lives inside the cancellous bone? Red bone marrow. So is it okay if I'm just producing a child's amount of blood? No. So, as the cancellous bone grows thicker and thicker, the osteoclasts recognize that there's plenty of structure there, and osteoclasts begin to take out the internal layers of compact bone, right? And as the bone grows larger and larger, as you add a compact layer, you take away an internal compact layer and grow more and then remodel it into cancellous bone. And so little by little by little, as the bone grows larger, the bone cells inside are remodeling the internal layers so that you always have basically the same amount of compact bone on the outside, but you have cancellous bone more and more and more reshaped on the inside. So there's more and more room for red bone marrow, and we have the red bone marrow needed for the adult human body. So the growth of a bone, yes, is adding more compact layers to the outside, but remodeling the internal layers at the same time. Everybody got that basic picture? Now that works for most bones, but not for all bones. That works again for almost everything except for the long bone. If you're looking at a long bone and you think, how wide was this bone when it was a child's bone? You know, if it's maybe an inch in width right now, maybe it was a half inch when you were a 6-year-old or something. So you add layers and layers and layers and layers, okay? But you've only added maybe a half an inch here. How long was this bone when it was a 6-year-old's bone? You know? Maybe half the length as it is now, right? So this bone got much, much longer than it got wide, right? So just adding some extra compact layers couldn't account for the growth in length. And that's what we see. Bones that have to grow exceptionally long or have to grow from the inside out can grow not only externally by adding more layers, but they can grow internally. And you see in the picture right here, of the proximal end of the femur, 2 growth plates, or what are called epiphyseal plates. Notice we call them that because they're in the epiphysis of the bone. The epiphyseal plates remain cartilaginous while the child is growing, while the teenager is growing. So there's actually several soft places in the epiphyses of all long bones in a child. The bone is actively growing from the inside. Okay, so let me do this one more time just to make sure I got all of this. So what we were saying here is that the growth plates remain cartilaginous through the growing period, childhood and teenage years. The tissue in here is soft. This picture makes it look a little thicker than it actually is. It's actually a little thinner than that, but it is soft. The bone is soft in this place. Ground substance is being produced at a tremendous rate. What that is doing is shoving the 2 ends of the bone further and further apart. As it does, osteoblasts and osteoclasts out at the site, out at the edges of that, are ossifying the bone, or causing it to change from cartilage into bone. And it's just that the production of cartilage is always faster than the ossification, than of the edges being changed into bone. As long as you can keep that cartilage being produced at a faster rate than the ossification is, this bone will continue to grow. You hit your teenage years, you get extra shots of growth hormone from the pituitary gland in your body, and that cartilage grows extra fast. And sometimes you see kids just seem to grow 2 or 3 inches in a year. Sometimes teenagers can report growth pains in their bones because the bone has to change so rapidly. Sometimes the bone doesn't ossify as much, and there is some torque or some flex on the bone, and that can cause some pain. Not hugely, but you're going to be able to notice that there are changes in your bone, and you can feel it. Okay? So bones can grow from the inside out at these places called epiphyseal plates of the long bone. Now, once your body begins to slow down that growth process, as that winds down somewhere between perhaps 16 and your early 20s, maybe 22, 21, 22, somewhere in there your body stops growing, right? Somewhere in there the cartilage production slows down, and the osteoblasts keep up their work with the osteoclasts, and at some point they solidify the bone right through that spot. You'll still see the remnant of what that was. You'll call it an epiphyseal line now, because you can still, if you cut open a bone, you can find where that growth plate was. But because the bone is solidified now, the bone is no longer going to grow in length. All of us got to a certain height at a certain point, and we seemed to stop, and that was it. And this is the height we'll be for the rest of our lives. So bones can grow externally, and they can also grow internally. And the long bones are the best example of this, although there's some others like the coxa that I just explained about. So if we take and sort of summarize all of this now, right, we talked about 5 bone shapes, right? Need to know that the long bone has some unique characteristics and some terminology that you should know. The periosteum is not only in the long bone. Every bone has a periosteum. It's an important feature to know in the bone because it's the link between the bones and their attachment to muscles. And then we talk generally about bone growth, but epiphyseal plates would be specific here. And you should be able to know and identify those. Okay? So any questions then about the lecture today? Everybody good with that?